Welcome to Nous, the podcast where we tackle the deepest questions about the mind through conversations with cutting-edge thinkers in philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience. I'm your host, Ilan Goodman, and my guest in this episode could be described as a medical doctor who thinks we transcend our biology, or perhaps as a neuroscientist who thinks there's much more to us than our brains. Raymond Tallis was an NHS consultant and Professor of Geriatric Medicine for many years, but is also an extraordinarily accomplished writer and thinker. He has penned numerous works of philosophy, of poetry, and of fiction. To his fans, he is a champion of humanism and the humanities. To his critics, he's an obfuscator who stubbornly refuses to acknowledge the power of science to transform our self-understanding. Raymond Tallis, welcome to Nous.
Thank you.
Now, your work has been a source of stimulation and of reflection for me over the years, so it's a real pleasure for me to be able to speak to you in person. And one of the books of yours, which I have on the shelf at home, is a collection of essays entitled In Defense of Wonder. And it seems to me that a central feature of a lot of your work is not to solve mysteries as such, but in a way to relish in them, to cultivate wonder. Is that a fair characterization?
You're absolutely right. And that's why, although I think science is our greatest cognitive achievement, scientism is to be avoided because it actually flattens out wonder. You end up with a position such as that of Steven Weinberg, who says that the more we understand the universe, the more meaningless it is. As far as I'm concerned, we have an absolute excess of meaning in many ways, and scientism, as it were, drains meaning out of the world. It disenchants the world in a way that I think doesn't do it justice, and in particular, the human world.
And you would call scientism the overreach of science, or the use of scientific reasoning in areas where it's not appropriate?
It is. It's the belief that objective, quantitative science basically will ultimately be able to explain everything, not just about the material universe, but about we humans who are puzzling over it.
Right. Well, that mystery is one that is very important to your work and perhaps of most relevance here, which you've called the uniqueness of human consciousness. And that's definitely one that you are keen to defend and celebrate. Could you just sort of introduce us to this idea of the uniqueness of human consciousness? In what way do you think it is unique?
Well, first of all, a bit of framework. I'm a humanist, and a lot of people think humanists have done their job when they've distanced themselves from religion, or indeed been very rude about religion. They think that's what the job of the humanist is. And then they think the alternative is naturalism, the notion that essentially we are parts of nature, that we're very similar in all the relevant respects to our nearest primate kin. And I'm equidistant from religion and from naturalism. And in order to defend that, there are several things one has to do. One has to open one's eyes, look at what is in front of one's nose, and see in all those ways that humans are different from our nearest animal kin. So most of my philosophy books have been less argumentative than descriptive. In many ways, when I talk about human agency, when I talk about selfhood, what I offer are what Clifford Geertz called thick descriptions. You actually look at the phenomenology of human behavior and indeed of the consciousness that is behind that behavior. So in what ways are we profoundly different? One of the places we can begin is the level of our self-consciousness. We have a sense of ourselves extended through time. We have an explicit time sense. That time sense is shared. So I draw on a shared past, and I reach into a shared future. And although there is some evidence of mental time travel, so-called, in other creatures, even in scrub jays and so on, there isn't that shared future, that landscape of possibility that we share between us, nor is that the common past, in which there is personal memory united into collective memory, united into a human history, which can be very potent in our lives. And behind that, again, is something absolutely fundamental. And this is where many ethologists and comparative psychologists would agree with me, which is what's called shared or joined intentionality. That is to say, we actually join our consciousnesses in ways that other animals don't do. A very simple example of that is through pointing.
Okay, can I just pause you there? So you've raised time and intentionality as two really crucial features of human consciousness that separate us from the rest of the natural world?
Absolutely. And when I say intentionality, I mean shared intentionality, the sense of a public space in which we are located. I mean, it's probably true to say that humans are unique in having a sense of objects and a world that has intrinsic properties that exceed or transcend their own sensibility, their own sense experience. We have a sense of a public shared world which transcends our own personal experiences, which is unique to humanity.
So just to explore this idea of time and the human sense of time, of the past and the future and the present, presumably part of your critique of an entirely naturalistic, perhaps, understanding of that is that it can't be reduced to the biology of the body and the brain. Is that right? So it's not just that we have a sense of time, it's that that's not explainable in terms of biology and neuroscience, etc. Is that your argument?
Spot on. It seems to me a brain at time t1 is at time t1. It's confined to t1. Raymond Tallis at t1 is aware of yesterday and tomorrow, this morning, this afternoon. I'm extended in time in the way that no material object is extended in time. That is to say, extended in time at a particular moment. Of course, a brain endures over time, but so does a pebble.
Okay. Presumably, one might respond by saying, well, we can build some sort of computational devices, maybe not sort of androids as yet, that have memory, that can design plans for the future and carry them out. So computationally, these tasks might seem tractable to manifest in a material system that we could perhaps design and build, and that presumably could come about through evolutionary processes as well, biologically. So isn't that a problem for you?
Not at all. And I think the problem doesn't arise because in your description of what computers do, you're personifying them. You're ascribing to computers that they have memory. That is to say, that they are not identical with their state at a particular time. And in fact, one of my aphorisms, which I've repeated far too often, is if you want to computerize a person, you basically personify a computer. Just like if you want to basically brainify a person, you personify the brain and you ascribe to the brain or a computer all sorts of properties and faculties that actually are unique to human beings. So, of course, a computer has a memory for us. It's a prosthesis, and its previous states are available to us. They're available to us as its previous states, but they're not available to itself as its previous states. Just like a computer doesn't plan, we use computers in order to support our own plans. I think I published a whole book on the language, which enables us to cross, as it were, the brain-person barrier or the computer-person barrier by transferred epithets. We describe brains and computers in terms that are entirely appropriate to human beings and inappropriate to computers standing by themselves or brains standing by themselves.
Okay, I think I have that. Is that why the mind is not a computer?
That's exactly why the mind is not a computer. Of course, the idea of the mind is a computer has now become a rather passé idea. When I wrote it in the 1990s, that book, it was seen to be the cutting edge. But most people now recognise that the mind is in no sense a computer for all sorts of reasons. But actually, the reasons often given aren't deep enough.
It is perhaps worth saying that the way we talk about ourselves and the way we talk about our brains is infused with language drawn from the computational metaphor all the time, isn't it? We talk about representing, we talk about information processing. We often talk about the brain as processing information. In fact, it's very difficult for people to talk differently. I find it's very difficult for me to talk any differently about, what's happening in the brain when patterns of light fall on the retina, and that information there you are. That pattern of activity is transduced via neurons and then transformed, and it seems to, and here's another word, represent the outside world. It seems to code for or encode, another one, features of the external world. So if the mind, or the brain at least, isn't a computer, do we have to do away with all of these terms like represent, encode, process information? And what do we replace them with?
I'm not sure what we should say about the brain, but if we think that is how the brain makes us persons, then I think it's entirely wrong. But the word representation is one that, if you look at carefully, you cannot represent something unless it has been presented. So you need presence. So already you're, as it were, giving free to the computer presence. Likewise, information. There's no information anywhere except ultimately where there is somebody delivering it and somebody receiving it. Take away recipients and recipients and transmitters of information, and all you've got is material physical processes. Of course, if you accept that you can have information in the absence of consciousness, then you do end up, you're at the top of a slippery slope. And at the bottom of the slippery slope is the notion that the whole of the universe is information. Or even as David Chalmers says, any causal interactions essentially are the transmission of information. So basically you can imagine Mars, which has never been visited by any of us, is absolutely a buzz of information. Presumably it's endlessly telling itself about itself. And that, of course, is nonsense. Once you spread the word information beyond you and me, sharing something I intend to tell you, something you understand, go beyond that, there's no limit then. You can make anything, any event, physical event, be a transmission of information. So we've got to be very careful when we use words like representation and information. It's a very useful way of talking about computers. Just like it's very good to talk about a thermometer, to say it tells us how hot things are. Of course, it doesn't know how hot things are. Without our presence, it doesn't tell us anything. It's just a bit of mercury going up and down. So it's very important to realize that all of these things, these devices, only work ultimately in the presence of human beings. There may be many steps in between. For example, this recording we're making can be stored away on your shelf for 6 months. And we say there's information on your shelf. Not really. It's potential information. So when you play the tape, then you're a recipient of information.
Gosh, I mean, the trouble with you, Rez, you're so fluent and you draw on so many years of writing enormous works on these things. It's very difficult to keep up. I mean, lingering in my mind was a phrase you used earlier to reject the idea of representation as it's often used. And you said, well, you can't represent something unless you grant presence.
Yeah.
To the computer or to it, and so you're tacitly sort of
awareness of presence.
Yes. Of presence. Okay. I mean, I guess what worries me is it feels a bit like that's a sort of clever linguistic rejection. I don't understand how that demolishes or prevents us from using the idea of representation as people want to use it. Can you just elaborate a little bit more?
Certainly. I mean, let me give you a very straightforward example. An image in a puddle. Basically, there are images in puddles all over the world which have never been visited by human beings. They are not really images. They're simply interactions of light and energy. It's only when I come across the puddle, and actually I look at myself in the puddle, that I have images. In other words, the image or the representation requires a conscious being to translate, if you like, the isomorphism between an object and a reflecting surface, to translate that into an image. I would like to put to you that there are no images on Mars, even if there is water, and I've forgotten where there isn't.
Okay, so an image is only an image by virtue of being perceived or interpreted as such?
Absolutely. In other words, yeah, there has to be a recipient to turn that energy, that isomorphism between a source and a reflecting surface into an image.
And isomorphism, just structural similarity, the fact that it's somehow similar.
It has the same form as the object.
Okay.
Neither of them has an appearance
Yes.
until actually a conscious human being sees either the one or the other.
You've made it clear that you reject the idea that that minds are computational. Now we've explored this idea of representation, and you've said why you don't think brains represent. What I'm still a bit worried about is whether that's a terminological issue, because representation implicitly demands an observer, and we're talking about phenomena where there are no observers. Is your dispute terminological, that we can't use the term represent because we're tacitly assuming an agent to do some observing, or is it some more profoundly sort of metaphysical?
I think it's a bit under column A and a bit under column B. It seems to me the total dependency on using personifying terms in describing brain activity indicates that it isn't just a purely linguistic choice. If people were going to describe the brain without, as it were, personification, then all they would do is replicate a series of spikes. And that was all they could offer. When you say the spike is a representation, or the spike is guessing at some future, then already you've gone beyond what you're observing. And I think that's the important thing. There is no neutral language in this game, it seems to me. And that's how you can cross the brain-mind barrier without doing any work, because you describe what's happening in the brain as if it were some mental phenomenon.
Now, throughout your career, you have attacked attempts to explain what it is to be human purely using the tools of neuroscience or biology or evolution. And you've used the terms neuromania and Darwinitis to help express those ideas. But what I wanted to ask is, in your long medical career as a doctor and as a neuroscientist and researcher, did you not depend on seeing patients as organisms, as perhaps malfunctioning biological systems, in order to do the job?
Thank you. That's a good opportunity to make some general points there. The first is, of course, the brain is a necessary condition of everyday life. Chop my head off and my IQ falls quite precipitously. Bash me on the head, I lose consciousness. I ran a stroke service, so I know exactly how damage to the brain in very precise ways can affect our functioning as persons. That every single aspect of our life, from the slightest tingle of sensation to the most exquisitely forged sense of self, is dependent on the brain. So the brain is a necessary condition of our being human beings. That's neuroscience. And that's why I hope I contributed to neuroscience by looking at that particular. Neuromania is the notion that the brain is not merely a necessary condition, but also a sufficient condition, that what I am is my brain. So if you just preserve my brain in functioning the usual way, you preserve Raymond Tallis. And it isn't a sufficient condition. And let's remind ourselves the difference between a necessary and sufficient condition. In order to be knocked down by a bus in London, it's necessary for me to be in London. I'm very pleased to say that is not a sufficient condition. Otherwise, I would have been knocked down by a bus coming to see you, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. So it's very important to notice the difference between the necessary dependency on the brain, and the brain incorrectly being interpreted as a sufficient condition, or indeed being identical with what I am.
Good. Okay. So a brain is necessary in order for there to be a mind, but it's not sufficient.
Yeah.
What are some of the other conditions? What are the sufficient conditions? If it's possible to list them, I don't know. But
quite. I mean, I've been accused of all sorts of things, having a hidden religious agenda, for example, which for a humanist is a bit upsetting. But I've also been accused of being a dualist, that somehow I think the mind is a ghost in the brain machine. And I'm not that either. I'm not a panpsychist either, who imagines somehow that mind was there all over the world and it comes together in peculiar ways in people like you and me, or objects like you and me. I'm an ontological agnostic. I don't think we have any idea of the relationship between the brain as a necessary condition of what we are and the brain as a sufficient condition. But here's one way of looking at the gap. If you look at the brain, as I have in many circumstances, right from doing neurophysiology as a student onwards, what you see is neural activity, which is basically ions going through semi-permeable membranes all over the brain. Now, that is clearly utterly different from sensory awareness. And one important way it's different is the ions are what they are, but my sensory awareness is about something quite different from what's going on in me. So whatever's going on in me that enables me to be aware of you sitting in front of me actually isn't identical with my awareness of you. Isn't identical with the aboutness of my experience. And so utterly unoriginally, I would see centrally to our understanding of personhood is intentionality, the sense that we have an awareness that is about things and indeed persons other than ourselves. That's not at all original. Intentionality was first identified by the Stoics. It became a very important part of medieval philosophy, and then it's been absolutely central to phenomenology since Brentano's famous book in 1874. What happens? So that's about consciousness. You may say, well, that's shared between ourselves and chimps, for example, or indeed ourselves and octopuses. So what's different from us is joined or shared intentionality, which is something we talked about earlier on. But you can see that is the point at which we open up a gap between the biological brain and the cultural human.
Okay, so let's just remind ourselves that the sort of shared intentionality, I mean, it's quite a sort of simple idea in a way of like the shared gaze of pointing and understanding that you can, that groups of human beings can share a focus, can represent an interest, or I can't use the word represent. We can represent an interest because pointing, we are conscious beings.
Yes,
okay.
So yeah.
Okay. But what you're suggesting is that is a fundamental distinction between animals and humans.
Yeah.
And that it is irreducible to biology.
It's a point from which we take off from biology, and I hope we'll talk a little bit about, given that I'm a Darwinian but not a Darwinitic, how we thought we took off from biology. I hope we come to that in due course, because I owe that to people who may accuse me of being regressing to pre-Darwinian thought. But let's think about something that appears to be simple, but on close inspection isn't. Pointing. I wrote a book on pointing because it seems to me that was itself a pointer to something very different about human beings. Two things about pointing you need to know. One is it's universal in human beings, and the other is what's called declarative pointing, pointing where you share something. Doesn't happen in any other animals. There's a little bit of what's called imperative or gimme pointing in chimpanzees in captivity, but shared intentionality of declarative pointing isn't seen in any other creature other than human beings. Now, let's think about pointing. I mean, it's thrilling when you see a child, even before it's acquired language, between 8 and 10 months, starting to point things out. And what it's doing is it recognizes its body is visible to its parents or whoever. It recognizes that parent has a different viewpoint from itself. That's why it has to point things out. It recognizes that the parent is aware of him. Also recognize that the parent will be able to interpret the gesture. And at the heart of it, though, is a desperate desire to share something. It's lovely, but infants can drive you absolutely crackers by pointing things. They're almost status punctilious for much of the time, and it's because they want to share things. And that appetite for sharing experience is something that's absolutely central to humans, whereas it isn't there in other animals. If you think about Jane Goodall, who spent a lot of time amongst primates, she said she felt very sad because they were sort of sealed off from each other. They were virtually monads. She attributed it to lack of language. I think it goes deeper than that. It begins with something that is evident in pointing, which is the lack of the sense, fully developed sense of others, and a desire to share things with them just for the sake of sharing it, not in order to fulfill some biological end. People may say, well, hang on a moment, there is a theory of mind to some extent in some primates. Yes, but it isn't developed to the extent it is in us. And it doesn't grow and grow and grow till we reach a stage at which we have a very complex sense of the complexity of others. And that's the foundation, really, of our civilization.
Okay, so I mean, to an extent, to a large extent there, you're drawing on empirical work to show that there's no evidence of intentionality in animals in the way that we have.
Yes, but particularly of shared intentionality.
Shared intentionality. So let's grant that distinction between animals and humans with respect to shared intentionality. The question then becomes, how did humans develop and acquire that shared intentionality? without some sort of miracle.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you wanted to go on to. So many philosophers and neuroscientists will be trying to understand that question from an entirely naturalistic scientific perspective. Yeah. You think they're doomed to failure, don't you? Why?
I'm a good Darwinian. So I think the organism Homo sapiens was generated by the same processes as generated octopuses and fleas and so on and so forth. So the question is, what was it about the organism Homo sapiens that suddenly triggered its moving off in a different direction? In other words, the widening gap between us and indeed our nearest primate kin. I offer a just so story in a book called The Hand, A Philosophical Inquiry into Human Beings, and it actually looks at three elements that made humans different. One is our relationship to our own forelimbs. We have, and this is massively unoriginal, we have full pad-to-pad contact between our index finger and our thumb. And associated with that, we have fractionated finger movement, which particularly in relation to the index finger. So that we've got this curious hand, this organ, which is quite different from an organ seen in any other beasts. And Aristotle calls it the tool of tools. And many philosophers, including Kant, felt that the hand was the window onto the mind. Two other things are important. One is the upright position, which we assumed, it's always thought, when we moved out of the forests into the savannah, took place about 5 million years ago, roughly that. That suddenly liberates the hand, being no longer what Sherrington called a locomotor prop, but to be a delicate organ available for all sorts of purposes, gestures and so on and so forth. And the third is, by having our heads now elevated, vision, the most uncoupled of all our senses, becomes central to our experience and our perception. So essentially, those three things together started a process, not a sudden miraculous flip. I believe that many primates, probably as Jane Goodall felt, are so close to the threshold of a process which has happened in us over several millions of years, which has become more and more self-conscious, self-aware.
But those three factors you mentioned, our relationship to our limbs, the upright position, the outward gaze, those all seem totally amenable to scientific inquiry and explanation through research. Why do those pose an insuperable obstacle?
What I'm saying is the result is essentially a very complex subjectivity, which you and I have, awareness of each other, which isn't amenable to quantitative objective measurement, or not reducible to the kind of quantitative objective measurements that we do when we look at a brain using a brain scan, or when we, as I did, record from neurons and so on and so forth. None of that would be perfect for looking at lower organisms and seeing how the nervous system works, and it may be quite helpful for me understanding how certain movements are possible and not others. What it doesn't deal with is the next step, which is now, with all that equipment on board, slowly but surely, we become much more interactive, and we slowly but surely enter a community of minds. A community of minds where we have a whole landscape of artifacts, joined agency, institutions, normative sense, and so on, all of which takes us way beyond what's happening inside the brain. For me, to look inside the brain to understand human society and human beings is a bit like listening to an isolated acorn with a stethoscope, hoping to hear the rustling of the leaves in the whole wood.
So our capacity for shared intentionality emerges through fairly straightforward, well, very complex, but scientifically investigatable and explainable evolutionary processes. Yes?
We're a bit careful about evolutionary processes, because I think we need to separate Darwinian type evolution from the notion of cultural evolution, which, if you try and Darwinize it, you end up with meme theory and all sorts of other nonsense, but perhaps we can deal with that in due course. I think a progressive change, and it took a long time. My God, this wasn't a miraculous jump.
But aren't you saying that intentionality, in some sense, can't be explained by those very things you're drawing on to explain its emergence?
I think, if you think of the brain as a platform, and collectively we jump off the brain, to be able to trace what's happening when we're in the air, you can't sort of, as it were, pull us back into the brain. We can't go right back into the darkness inside our skulls. So if you want to understand a human institution or politics, looking to neuroscience to explain politics is bonkers. It's again like hoping to hear the whispering of the trees, or the leaves in the wood, by listening to an acorn.
Okay, but what if you study the trees and the wind through science? What can you explain then?
Basically, I wouldn't want you to take the metaphor literally. It is genuinely a metaphor. But clearly you need a different approach. Neuroscience is terrific. I added my few grains of neuroscience knowledge to the antheap of the fantastic cognitive monument that is neuroscience. But when it comes to understanding human institutions, literature, ordinary stuff like saying, I'll see you next Wednesday, all of that, we need a different kind of approach. I think we often, and I think there's a mistake sometimes. People think, if we want to look at the difference between humans and other animals, we ought to look at stuff like writing symphonies and fretting over transfinite numbers and so on. Well, I don't do those kind of things, but I tell you I do things like saying, see you next Wednesday and don't be late. Now, when you try to understand that, to look inside the brain, to make sense of that, how it's possible, our time sense, the complex language involved, the sense of the normative sense and so on, you're looking in the wrong place.
But is your point just about almost levels of explanation? So it's not useful to look to neuroscience to explain politics, or you can't do sociology by looking at brain scans. Now that's a point many people would accept without also adopting a kind of anti-naturalistic stance, which you seem to be doing sometimes.
I think naturalism has its place. Thank heavens for naturalism, because a lot of it generated medicine. The naturalist approach to kidneys, thank you very much indeed. We can treat renal failure. Indeed, the naturalist approach to strokes, we are now greatly improved the management of stroke patients. We don't have a metaphysical treatment of a patient who comes in acutely into a stroke ward, and I basically set up stroke services and so on. So naturalism has its place for things that you're looking at objectively and quantitatively, and when you're looking at, as it were, a causally closed universe in which A causes B and so on and so forth. When we come to the human world, then a completely different approach is required. And it's probably not just a matter of levels, although it certainly is that. In other words, sociology doesn't benefit from physics. So of course, it's not just. It may be something deeper, and this is where I feel quite ambivalent, which is the whole place of mind in the cosmos, to use Thomas Nagel's phrase. Where does the subject, first-person being, arise in what, from the viewpoint of science, is largely it's not even third person, it's a no-person collection of mass, energy, and so on and so forth. And I think we have a really, really interesting question to ask there, because we won't ask it so long as we actually close off the debate by thinking in terms of a naturalism, and there are many forms of naturalism, but a naturalism that sees physics or the objective laws of nature as the only way to, as it were, discover new knowledge.
Okay, I think maybe that's a point to pivot into a slightly different topic, which is something you've kind of alluded to, which is the problem of phenomenal consciousness, the feeling of what it's like to see red, to see yellow, something that philosophers have often struggled with and found to be maybe irreducible. It's very difficult to understand how you can explain the feeling, the seemingly sort of elemental feeling of seeing a colour by accounting for the neural activity that underpins that or is correlated with it. And I interviewed Philip Goff for the podcast, and this is a key sort of datum that he wants to take into account, motivating his ultimate panpsychist position. And you also mentioned the objects and the methods of science as being entirely impersonal. That's another thing motivating, I think, his understanding of what science is and what science can provide is another plank in Philip Goff's ultimate argument for panpsychism. So he thinks it can never account for phenomenal consciousness in the terms in which we've currently set up science. But you aren't a panpsychist,
no,
and you disagree with that conclusion. So, but you seem to have sympathy with those steps of the argument. Am I right?
The very things that have driven Philip to panpsychism are concerns that I share. That there is no way by objective science we can eventually, as it were, cash out what it is to have an experience. It's amazing that philosophers regard this as the great discovery in the philosophy of mind of the last 30 years, that the mind is about what it is like to be such and such. I mean, that's a sort of scandal of philosophy, that's a revelation. But I'm totally sympathetic of what's driven Philip towards panpsychism. So what's behind it? Fine. The destination he reaches, I'm afraid I don't agree with, for two reasons. Panpsychism has two major problems. One is the combination problem, and the other is the disaggregation problem. The combination problem says if mind is everywhere, in pebbles and in water and so on, how does it have special properties when it comes to me? How do we aggregate all these sequins of mindfulness or quasi or proto-experience? How do they all add up to a subject with a viewpoint? And basically that we then have as much a bigger problem as we had when we were wondering how a brain can give rise to how it's like. The other is the disaggregation problem, because some panpsychists have indicated basically there's just a single mind, and that what we have to do is think about how to break it up into individual viewpoints. So Ireland's viewpoint, Ray's viewpoint, the viewpoint of so on and so forth. And that is clearly a problem. So Philip's view, it seems to me, is a corrective, but we need a corrective to the corrective. My own viewpoint is that please let's not have too early conceptual closure, because we haven't got anywhere near to understanding the place of the mind in the cosmos. So we'll never make progress if we have a naturalistic viewpoint, or indeed if we, or rather a materialist naturalist viewpoint, or if we're panpsychists. These are too early to close things off. A quote from Jerry Fodor, which I often cite, which he says, by the time the mind-body problem is finished with us, we'll have had to set aside every single one of our most cherished and fundamental assumptions. I'm totally with him there, because in many ways, this is the big opportunity when we recognize we don't have that kind of explanation to wake up. Think about physics in 1900. There was that little irritating business about black body radiation. Just ignore it. No. As a result of not ignoring it, taking seriously, and having very radical views arising, we've had the whole of quantum mechanics and pretty well the whole of the artifactual landscape of the 20th and 21st century. So I think this problem is one we should continue banging our head against before we fall too easily into some kind of solution. We owe it to ourselves to deny ourselves a premature answer.
Okay, I mean, it's fascinating that you draw on radical conceptual change that's happened through science, because that's something that some of your critics would throw back against you and say, well, someone like Patricia Churchland or Daniel Dennett would say, well, the history of science should teach us humility, right? That holding on to cherished concepts or ways of seeing things because we can't conceive of any other way has proven to be a mistake time and time again. And the thing that you're holding on to is certain cherished concepts about the uniqueness of human consciousness that science is showing us are just wrong. Now, is your argument with them, is it fundamentally a conceptual one, or is there any kind of empirical evidence that you could imagine, or would you acknowledge even the remote possibility of evidence to change your mind?
I think we ought to be careful here. I mean, when I'm sort of denying that currently science has anything to offer in explaining consciousness, I'm not like somebody who in the 18th century thought phlogiston was absolutely, the bee's knees and caloric and ether and so on and so forth. We're not talking about things that objective science can settle one way or another. We're talking about something much more fundamental. Yes, quantum mechanics, so far as those who practice it understand it, has clearly transformed our sense of what the material world is. But I don't think it actually has produced a metaphysics. In fact, it's in a total mess metaphysically. I published a 720-page book on the nature of time, and the first third of it was looking critically at the claims of physics to be the last word on the nature of time, claims of physics to be metaphysics. And if you look very closely, it is actually, first of all, it doesn't quite know, it doesn't even begin to understand the nature of time. That's for the first thing. Secondly, and most importantly, it ignores some central aspects of time, such as tensed time, such as having a viewpoint in time, a position in time, those kinds of things whose reality you cannot deny, but they are obliged to deny in order, as it were, to give priority to the objective viewpoint, to the view from nowhere. Of course, the view from nowhere would not actually allow us to have any physicists, any physics, any instruments, and so on and so forth. So I don't think it's a question of, as it were, poo-pooing the future of science, but actually challenging the notion that somehow, by the kind of objective quantitative work we do, we'll crack metaphysical problems.
So if we accept your claim that science is not the place to look to settle our fundamental metaphysics, do you really have such faith in philosophy to settle such questions? It doesn't have a great track record settling really anything, but certainly not metaphysics.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, if philosophy was a police force and it was being, as it were, defined by its clear-up rate of its problems, then it would be in special measures. Now, that's absolutely sure. But I don't think philosophy is entirely about producing simple answers to clear-cut questions. First of all, often an answerable question becomes science, so philosophy almost loses its, if you like, part of its agenda when science makes some kind of progress. But philosophy is, I think, not about that kind of problem solving. It's about clarifying, as Gilbert Ryle would say, the conceptual geography that surrounds a problem, the fundamental presuppositions. And philosophy ultimately, by the way, is waking up out of wakefulness. Wakefulness is, and untaking the taken for granted. But you may say, am I looking to philosophy? Well, I'm not. Am I looking to remind people of the phenomena and the thick descriptions, as it were, of everyday life? Yeah, if that's philosophy, then philosophy is where we need to be in order to reset the question. So certainly looking critically at the concepts, looking critically at their coherence, but also reminding people of what it is, as it were, to be a human being, and therefore what the question is.
So Wilfrid Sellars articulated the aim of philosophy as the attempt to explain how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. A quotation I know you've been fond of using yourself. But I guess what worries me and I think other people about your views is that you seem to introduce or reinforce discontinuities between humans and other animals, for example. So things aren't hanging together as such. In fact, you've said you're an ontological agnostic. So you're not a materialist, you're not a dualist, you're not a panpsychist. You just don't know. That's kind of infuriating, isn't it? Is that what sort of riles so many people up about your ideas?
It may be the case. And I mean, as you said, I'm very sympathetic to what Wilfrid Sellars said, but it seems to me we're not going to, as it were, make progress on the mission statement of philosophy, as he's described it so beautifully, unless we set aside certain presuppositions, unless we wake up out of the premature cognitive closure that results from assuming certain starting positions. So, yes, I think that's a terrific aim for philosophy, but by the way, I don't think we're on the right track at the moment. Scientism is certainly not that right track.
So, one of the ideas that you defend is that we have free will.
Yeah.
That seems to many, neuroscientists certainly, to be an untenable idea. To naturalists who think that we're part of the causal nexus of the physical world, there really is no place for free will. I wanted to use Benjamin Libet's experiments as a kind of case study, because I know that you've thought about them and you reject his conclusions. But I find them quite simple and fairly compelling, I think, to me and to many others. So Benjamin Libet did this famous series of experiments in the 80s where participants had to move a finger or a wrist voluntarily at a time of their choosing. And Libet then got them to mark when they felt the intention to move by watching a clock. At the same time, he was monitoring brain waves using EEG. And the ultimate conclusion was that the brain wave, or the impulse to move, occurred a third of a second before the conscious impulse to move the finger occurred, before the subjects experienced the impulse to move. Now, there have been many variants of this experiment, but the takeaway for Benjamin Libet, and I think for many others, is that the brain commits to a decision before we're consciously aware of making that decision.
Yeah.
Now, for many, this has undermined entirely the claim that we have free will, but not for you. In fact, it's a central plank of your view and your defense of humanism that we do have free will. So how do you reconcile your view with evidence like this?
You're absolutely right. It is central to humanism to believe we have free will, that we are, as the Enlightenment philosopher would say, an independent point of departure in the world. And Libet's experiments are very, very useful, not because of the conclusions he's drawn from them, but because they show what a misconceived notion some people have of the nature of an action. If you think of the subject, she's got to just move her finger. Wait a moment. Taking part in Dr. Libet's experiment involves the following: setting the alarm clock the night before to make sure you're not late, driving to the laboratory, finding a parking spot and not losing your temper because somebody's stolen it, finding your way down the corridor, going into Dr. Libet's laboratory, listening very carefully to what he has to say and understanding what he says, and then, basically within the framework of that experiment, making a little movement. Now, if you focus on that little movement, right, it's almost getting close to being a twitch. But this patient, this subject, is not enacting a twitch. She's taken a day off to do all of these things. So what does that tell you? It tells you that actions are much more complex than twitches. Secondly, that the time relationship between self-perception of the intention is irrelevant here, because the intention is being staggered over at least a day, or perhaps when she saw the advert in the newspaper in order to say, would you like to help people have brain damage by looking at these experiments and so on. And that brings us something else which we talked about earlier, which is the temporal depth of human consciousness. Mrs. Smith participates in the experiment by means of an action that's extended over time, each element of which would not have happened if it was not related to an explicit and conscious goal she had, not to let down Dr. Libet to turn up for the experiment. And by the way, what about Dr. Libet? It took him probably 4 or 5 years to put together the experimental design, to get the grant, and so on. So in a way, he too is extended in time, even in relation to these experiments. So if you're looking in the brain, all you find is an object that has certain properties at time t1. But actually, the individual involved is not just at time t1, either the experimenter or the experimentee. They are actually extended in time in a way that doesn't fit into the causally closed universe in which, for example, you have something like an intention which causes a twitch. That's a sort of causal model which doesn't fit in to action.
But surely, it's a simplified example which then can be generalized. So science often has to take as its subject matter operationalized situations, simplified situations where you can measure and control the circumstances, and then you want to be generalizing. You want to be developing insight into the world at large, the nature of things in general from that example. In fact, that's how I would say that's the sort of basic logic behind a lot of scientific work. And if it's the case that in this moment, the subjects are part of the causal nexus in a very straightforward way, that brain activity precedes their sense of a conscious awareness. So there's a sort of chain of physical events leading up to them moving their finger, which is in a sense a really obvious claim, right? If in that moment there's clear evidence that they're part of a physical causal nexus, is the natural next step not to just generalize that and say, well, we're always part of this physical causal nexus? So just saying that we're part of it, but we're somehow transcend it as well. It just seems slippery. I can't quite get a handle on why you think that all of the events leading up to it change that.
The sequence of events that brings Mrs. Smith to the laboratory, or that enables Dr. Libet to do the experiment, is a sequence of physical events that would not have been brought together unless they were driven or guided by a sense of the future. informed by a sense of the past. So you think of the millions of movements Mrs. Smith makes to getting to the laboratory, and you can see that they wouldn't have happened unless they were guided by a very bespoke intention, not like the intention of a migrating animal or something like that, not like the intention of some very small action of a dog eating food. This is a very bespoke intention. She's a good lady and she feels it fits with her. She's got a child with perhaps some brain injury and so on, and she thinks Dr. Libet is going to discover things that might help my child with brain injury. These are the kind of things that motivate human beings. So even if you were to focus on the physical elements, you can see that those elements wouldn't have been, as it were, put together in a chain if they hadn't been, as it were, requisitioned in relation to some explicit goal. And by the way, there's something people have overlooked always in discussing these experiments, which is timing your own intention. What is the intention to time the intention? When was there intention to time the intention? And you realize you've got a regression. Many people actually think that Libet is a rather crude dualist. He thinks there is something called an intention, which is the sort of free will bit, but actually it's already scooped by the brain, which has got its own agenda. And so can you see what I mean? Without that sense of temporal depth, without the sense of those elements of the action, very complicated action, wouldn't have taken place. I mean, she might say, I must nip into the shops on the way to Dr. Libet's laboratory but she doesn't forget what she's going to do. All of those elements, as it were, are requisitioned towards some bespoke end which she has selected.
So the person is never entirely dissolved into a physical causal nexus?
Not at all. And in a way, and I totally sympathise with your saying, well, we've got to start somewhere. Let's start with little simple things. But that, to me, is the same kind of mistake as doing an EMG on me on the way to meet you to try and understand what we're about. So you'd look at the electrical activity in my muscles as I go all the way from the Royal College of Physicians to the Athenaeum to see exactly what I'm really doing. What I'm really doing is going to see you, which is something that wouldn't be picked up by either an EMG or indeed by an EEG or a brain scan.
I mean, you've said you're an ontological agnostic, at the same time as rejecting materialism and dualism. But it seems to me those positions are difficult to occupy at the same time. So you want to say we're irreducible, but there's nothing else, or you don't know if there's anything else, but you can reject dualism as well. How can you have all of those positions at the same time?
Well, I know what I don't like, and whereas I still am awaiting the revelation. What I'm waiting for is a genius to break through all of this, and that genius ain't me, but who will say, yes, thanks to Tallis and thanks to many others, we can park up dualism, panpsychism, materialism now. And that's the now, and that's where I fail. But, who knows? We may get somebody who's infinitely brighter than me who will actually rethink the whole thing. But so long as we're in a state of cognitive and conceptual closure, we won't make any progress. So I suppose agnostic is probably not strong enough. I mean, I do reject certain elements, certain metaphysical world pictures, but all I know is I don't know yet. And I'll tell you another thing I know is nobody else does either.
That's certainly the case, I think. And where is your sense of wonder taking you at the moment? What mysteries are you exploring now?
I love the little things from which you can unpack big things. I wrote a book on pointing. At the moment, actually, I'm writing my summa, which is called Seeing Ourselves, which is about a philosophical basis for humanism. It begins with looking at our religious history. Then I do look at our relationship to our body as embodied subjects, which is absolutely fascinating. The notion you can be worried about your appearance is metaphysically bottomless. It is just extraordinary. Or that basically that this body, which is, as it were, the closest bit of the world to me, is largely hidden from me. There's a lovely line from Philip Larkin, which is basically our flesh surrounds us with its own decisions. And so that I'm looking at that. I look at our relationship to time and wonder about something as simple as see you next Wednesday, which is an extraordinarily profound statement. I look at facts. There's nothing matter of fact about facts. The very fact we deal with facts makes us unique in the universe. Looking also at selfhood, and we haven't touched on selfhood, but it is, again, very complex what it is to be Raymond Tallis, to be the same Raymond Tallis 1973 and 2000, whatever we are, and so on and so forth. Looking also at agency, which we've discussed, and then because it's bad philosophy, but sometimes bad philosophy is quite illuminating, looking at the notions of transhumanists who think we can upload our minds onto non-degradable material, replicate ourselves forever, and have a, as it were, a humanist version of immortality. And looking at that, and it is very interesting, these ideas, because they're so spectacularly wrong. I love big wrong ideas. I couldn't spend time with little errors. But the third part is saying, okay, we have to face the fact that we are mortal, that everything we love, including ourselves, is taken away from us, that there's no point at which all our meanings converge. If I had religious belief, all my meanings would converge in serving God. That would be, whatever I'm doing it in his sight or her sight, if you believe in another God. So I think I'm interested in the real challenge for humanism is flourishing without God. And I don't think we've even started looking at that in a way that at the right kind of depth. And then starting to mobilize some of the facts about our transcendence of nature and how we can do something with those facts about ourselves. In the end, I hope I die in a state of wonder. Indeed, even wondering as the ing fades away and I lose my agency.
Well, it's a characteristically ambitious project. It's wonderful. Raymond Tallis, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Oh, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.